Losing almost a fifth of its population to emigration. Should Cuba be concerned? Millions have left the communist island before, but the recent exodus is being called a migratory crisis. What is driving millions of Cubans to leave their homes? And can remittances compensate for a massive loss of its workforce? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Cuba's emigration. Well, many countries suffered in the wake of the pandemic, but in Cuba, the economic downturn that led to massive anti-government protests helped spawn an emigration crisis. Of course, U.S. sanctions have further aggravated the public's frustration with food shortages, a lack of medicine, and power outages, leaving many Cubans feeling desperate to seek a better life abroad. But with the U.S. closing the door to more migrants, what are their options? And is the proverbial grass really greener on the other side for Cubans? Here's a look.
Citizens are quitting Cuba in numbers never seen before.
I no longer have any friends because they have all left. I haven't left because I haven't had anyone to tell me, let's go. More people haven't left because the borders are closed. Otherwise, no one would be left here.
In just 2 years, Cuba's population has dropped from 11 million to 8.5 million, turning the country's demographic on its head.
In the case of Cuba, migration is focused onto the United States because it is the main settlement and because of everything that surrounds this phenomenon, so it does exist. It is a considerable number that is having the greatest impact in the history of demographics because its composition of young people, of women of reproductive age leaving, all of this has an impact.
The start of the surge can be dated back to the summer of 2021. On July the 11th that year, Cubans took to the streets. It was the largest anti-government protest since the revolution in 1959. COVID-19 had already eviscerated Cuba's vital tourism industry, and the Caribbean island was still reeling by the sanctions reintroduced by former US President Trump in 2017.
For the United States, the priority of destabilizing Cuba continues to take precedence over its interest in protecting its borders in terms of migration.
And now Havana's streets look like this. Houses are empty. The queues at the airport grow longer each day.
We decided to go this way. We know it's risky and could cost us our lives, but we have already decided, with God and with my saint, we are going forward.
Cuba has seen exoduses before. In 1965, 1980, 1994 are remembered in particular, but none of them can compare to today. If the current trend continues, a recent UN report projects that Cuba's population could fall below 6 million by the year 2100. New routes are opening up for the migrants. Before, many went to Ecuador, but today, most fly direct to Nicaragua. The US is still the #1 destination for Cubans, followed by Canada, Italy, Spain, and Mexico. These countries have a growing Cuban diaspora, made up with a significant proportion of people at prime working age. Leaving hasn't always been so simple. For a long time, it was virtually impossible. But things changed in 2013. The then US President Barack Obama relaxed the rules that restricted travel off the island, and Cubans began to travel more freely. Now the floodgates appear to have opened, and will probably remain so until Cuba achieves both economic and political stability.
Well, joining me now to talk further about Cuba's mass migration and its consequences are from Glasgow, author of We Are Cuba, Helen Yaffe. From Raleigh, North Carolina, political analyst and editor-in-chief for the Americas at Horizon Intelligence, Luis Campos. And from Miami, director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, Jorge Duany. Thanks all so much for being with me. You know, as mentioned, Cuba has seen several episodes of mass emigration before, but how different is it this time, both in where they're trying to emigrate to? For example, the United States is not exactly opening up its arms anymore, and the economic conditions of other countries are not necessarily providing opportunities. Helen, go ahead.
So I think the numbers are clearly unprecedented, but also unlike previous waves of immigration, particularly before the 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, this is very much characterized as economic immigration. Cuba has been going through a severe economic crisis, which has very strong results of both the pandemic and the loss of income, particularly through tourism having to be shut down, but also the massive increase in sanctions by the United States under the Trump administration, and then kept in place by Biden, who also added some sanctions of his own. And daily life has become extremely difficult as a direct result of those conditions, those sanctions. And of course, in an economic crisis like or any sort of crisis like COVID, most countries in the world can get, have a lender of last resort. They can get access to the international financial market, which Cuba is excluded from, again, because of US sanctions. So it's been a really tough time for Cubans.
But are they finding, Helen, from what you can see, are they finding better opportunities abroad? Does it make a qualitative difference to their lives and their families' lives back in Cuba that they go elsewhere to find work?
Well, I think, all you can do is sort of cite at the moment anecdotal evidence, and that will depend on who they have receiving them, accommodating them in the United States. So I'm aware of Cubans who have recently gone, and they're now cleaning the floors of airports. So, these are people who had fairly skilled jobs. Because it's also worth saying that, and this has been a case with the medical qualifications of Cubans, but the Bush administration introduced a medical parole program to encourage Cubans who are serving overseas as part of their Cuban medical internationalism to abandon their missions and go to a US embassy or consulate and then, get permission to go and live in the United States. But their qualifications weren't recognized. Mm-hmm. So they either face the choice of, taking up a low-skilled job, or they have to restart their training, but this time paying for their education, which is something that no Cubans have had to do in Cuba under the government from 1959, obviously a socialist government, which provides free healthcare, education, and so on.
Jorge, have you seen the same as far as this Cuban migration crisis, as they're calling it, is concerned? The same differences as times prior that Helen was noting? And what have been your observations of the Cubans, arriving particularly in the United States? Are they finding better lives?
Yeah, well, again, to begin with, the numbers are staggering. We haven't seen the size of this migration wave. At least 750,000 people have been registered as trying to reach the United States or actually being paroled into the U.S. since 2021. Some estimates are as big as 2 million people in that same period of time. So nothing compared to that since 1959, even though, again, if you look at the history of Cuban migration, there have been moments, for example, the 1980 Mariel exodus, where 125,000 people left in just 9 months. So another thing that I think distinguishes this wave is that a lot of people are now able to go back to Cuba, whereas in the past decades, that wasn't a possibility. So there's the beginnings of what looks like, I don't want to call it exactly a circular migration because it doesn't really seem to be a back and forth movement, but there's now the legal possibility for Cubans who are living abroad to go back to Cuba, as long as they do that in a period of 2 years, and then they can keep their properties, they can have health benefits and so on. So that's one of the reasons why it's such a difficult, it's difficult to estimate the exact number of people who are living abroad. As I mentioned, between 1 and 2 million people. Yeah. Now, in terms of the impact here, it is true that a lot of Cubans, at least on arrival, have to accept lower status jobs, either because they don't qualify for professional certifications, or because of the language issue, or because they don't have a legal status that allows them to work. But by and large, I think compared to what they leave behind, most Cubans do find that in terms of earnings, they make a lot more money than they do in Cuba. In fact, salaries in Cuba are so low. Some estimates are around $40 per month. So that is a very low salary, and anything really that they can find abroad will allow them to have a higher standard of living and then begin to send money back to their relatives in Cuba.
Let me ask Luis, if emigration in this massive wave is actually good for Cuba in some senses, and that it eases the pressure on services in the country, as well as, of course, boosting massive foreign currency remittances.
Yes, interestingly enough, we have seen data that indicates an actual contraction in the amount of current or foreign exchange entering Cuba in the last few months. Actually, we saw during the post-pandemic period a contraction of 3.3% in remittances. So what we see as very interesting is that despite the high number, some estimates consider about 23% of the population leaving the country in the past few years, that the remittances are actually contracting in the past few years. So obviously, emigration is within the interest of the Cuban government based on multiple pieces of evidence that we have seen. But in terms of the amount of money going into the island, we have not seen that. And the hypothesis that we're working on currently is that there's a possibility, we see two scenarios. One, in which entire family households are leaving the island. And the second scenario could be that there's a lack of trust in the country's future, which is disincentivizing further personal and family investments. And for example, what Jorge mentioned regarding the 24-month limit for Cubans to remain abroad before they get their assets or patrimony seized by authorities is a limit that's being right now proposed to be removed, and that is a sign that we have detected as that has the intention of promoting further investment through remittances into the island.
It's interesting, though, because it is very difficult to get any exact numbers on remittances, because Cuba, of course, is not a member of the IMF. It's not a member of the World Bank. But it is understood that a huge part of GDP is remittances still. And I've actually seen estimates that say between $2 and $3 billion, which for the Cuban economy is quite significant. But we do have to stress that because Cuba is not a member of the major international financial institutions, it really is hard to say exactly how much. So it's interesting that the data you've seen cites what it cites. But let me move on to Helen, because we're also looking at, a major factor in the weakening and destabilization of the Cuban economy is, of course, U.S. sanctions. And so now we're seeing more Cubans leave Cuba for the U.S. at a time that the United States doesn't necessarily want to see more people trying to cross its borders. So is the U.S., in a sense, destabilizing Cuba at its own expense?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the United States has always encouraged and weaponized migration of Cubans, emigration. It's used it as a political tool to say, look, these people are fleeing. Socialism doesn't work. And I think that in various points that has backfired. I mean, one was in the mid-1990s or 94, which one of your other interviewees referred to, when the Clinton administration was then forced essentially to sit down and negotiate migration accords with the Cubans. And they agreed to give 20,000 visas for Cubans to travel to the United States, whether that was to visit or to stay. Remember, there's immense collaboration between Cuban scientists and artists, sports people and so on. And, without the legal and official authorization for people to travel, it also builds up a backlog of people who are very frustrated. So during the from 2017, when the United States, a bit later, the United States started to effectively close down the consulate in Havana, and they got rid of the family reunification program for 5 years. And what that did is create a huge backlog of very frustrated Cubans who wanted to reunite, who wanted to travel, people, maybe their loved ones dying in the United States and they can't get there to say their farewell. So all of these human stories, terrible human stories about families torn apart. And now we have a scenario where clearly with the US election coming up in November, immigration is going to be or is already a huge battle point. And I suspect that, because Trump is saying he's going to be really hard on migrants, there may well be another increased wave of migrants trying to rush into the United States before, on the expectation of a Trump victory in the election. So, yeah, it's really tough. And I would say that, the effect for the Cubans is also really detrimental. I spoke just a couple of weeks ago to a director of a medical science center who described it as a demographic genocide. And, I think Cubans are really, they're aware that they're losing their middle sector, who are young, skilled young people, who would be contributing to national wealth, who would be caring for their own grandparents, parents and children, and they've lost that.
Before you go too far, I mean, we also have to mention as well, that there was, of course, the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 that, just all but guaranteed Cubans free entry if they made it to any U.S. border crossing, and that they would be given a visa where they could secure a job. That changed in September 2023. So Jorge, it's not what it used to be. There's a lot less sympathy now for Cubans because of the U.S. immigration crisis in the United States. So, I mean, what does the U.S. want with Cuba now that they're trying to deter any further immigration, but at the same time, the policy wants to punish Cuba?
Right, and I wanted to add to what was said before that the current administration, the Biden administration, has been trying to walk a very difficult line between the former Trump administration policy of maximum pressure, which of course was put in place and made life more miserable for Cubans, and then led to this massive number of people leaving all of a sudden after the pandemic. And on the other hand, trying to promote peaceful economic and political change in Cuba, specifically the mantra of fostering the private sector. And so in the past few months, we've seen some moves by the Biden administration, even though it hasn't lifted the Trump administration's sanctions against Cuba, to do that, to promote the private sector in the Cuban economy, which has been growing by fits and stops in the past few years. But it's not clear whether that policy will have the expected result by the Biden administration of deterring migration. At the same time, I wanted also to mention that since 2023, the United States has implemented a new policy, not only toward Cuba, but also toward Venezuela and Nicaragua and Haiti, of allowing them to enter the United States on parole. And the numbers we've seen suggest that about 100,000 Cubans have been allowed into the United States in the past year and a half, so to speak. However, these people do not have the right to permanent residence, and they cannot apply for the Cuban Adjustment Act because they're only allowed to enter temporarily for 2 years. Okay. Now, it may be the case that they are able to somehow remain in the United States, either legally or illegally, but that's in addition to the 700 or 1,000 or so people who have been encountered, as they say, by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So we're really seeing a very messy situation, not to mention, of course, there are now about 7,000 or so Cubans who are detained by the U.S. Coast Guard every year, the so-called rafters, which used to be the main way in which Cubans enter the United States without authorization.
Yeah. But Luis, let me ask you this. Are there kind of simple fixes for the Cuban economy that could actually occur at any time, especially if Kamala Harris, takes the White House? For example, allowing for tourism again. I mean, boosting tourism in Cuba could potentially turn so much of this around by providing, a massive number of jobs, or stop blocking, I should say, Europeans from ESTA if they travel to Cuba. That stopped a number of Europeans from going because they don't want to have to lie on the U.S. ESTA application and say they haven't been to Cuba. But if they do say they've been to Cuba, they have to go through an entire new set of paperwork to get a very difficult visa. It's very prohibitive. So, I mean, yeah, simple fixes perhaps on the cards if a new regime comes in the United States.
So I would say that certainly two elements that I would like to highlight. The first being the role of tourism into the potential economic recovery of the island, and then what a new administration might be able to do from the U.S. So the first thing that I want to mention is that it doesn't seem feasible that tourism in its own is going to be able to rescue the Cuban economy. Because we can keep in mind, for example, that certainly during the COVID pandemic and after that, we have seen the worst part of the economic crisis. But we have to keep in mind that some of the top effects of the crisis were present by in around 2017, and even a little bit prior of that. I mean, the last good economic year for Cuba was 2015 with around 4.4% growth in its GDP. So on its own, tourism, it doesn't appear to be the solution. Obviously, it will contribute if they flexibilize their policies and allow for a relaunch of the sector. And then
maybe I oversimplified it by saying, these simple solutions. But I mean, it would contribute something massive on the jobs front. And it would also open the door to opening other private businesses, which are allowed now in Cuba under this kind of hybrid system they have. It could be a step. And it could potentially start reversing this trend. Because let me come back to Helen about this. Because you talked about the doctor that you knew anecdotally that had come and ended up, cleaning floors of the airport instead of working as a medical practitioner. So unlike other countries in Latin America and the developing world, Cuba doesn't have, I'll put it this way, let's say the poverty of total humiliation, where people live in total excess alongside pretty excruciating poverty. It's kind of a shared poverty that still manages public health services and schools. And Cuba, compared to other Latin American neighbors, is safe. There are no gangs. There are no guns. There's relatively low crime comparatively. So is life better elsewhere, or do you think Cubans, if the economy starts to bounce back, will have a new appreciation after going abroad for what they had at home on their island?
Yes, we have to keep in mind that
go ahead, Helen, and then Luis will come back to you. Go ahead.
There is a Cuban-American scholar, Nelson Valdez, who always used to say, I think that we should take all 17 and 18-year-old Cubans and, let them go and live a year in capitalism, because then they'd come back and really appreciate the things they grew up with and took for granted. But I want to say something about your comment about tourism and if it bounces back. So, the big obstacle, actually, the blockade is there, which in the US they refer to as an embargo. But even if that was dismantled by a vote of Congress tomorrow, if Cuba remains on its very spurious inclusion on the state sponsors of terrorism list by the United States, then it is effectively blockaded. So, for example, if I, as a British citizen with a British bank account, tried to send money, humanitarian donation to Cuba after one of its terrible recent hurricanes, and that payment is blocked. But further than that, if I then try and send £1 sterling, it's not even dollars, to a European bank account, it's not going to Cuba, but I put the word Cuba in the reference of the transaction, that payment will be blocked. So if that's what's happening to me as an individual, you have to wonder, how can Cuba import those medicines that it provides that we just referred to, the educational equipment, you're showing images of climate change. Yeah, I've done co-produced a documentary about Cuba's response to climate change. It has a world-leading plan, but it's being held back because it can't get the necessary technology. And that's the same in medical science, where Cuba was the only country in the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean to produce a COVID-19 vaccine, but then couldn't get the syringes to vaccinate its population until, you know, another strain came and it really devastated the Cuban population. So these are really big contradictions. At the heart of this is Cuba's inclusion on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is why I, like so many Europeans, have had trouble getting into the United States, because we've been to Cuba, and that's designed to put people off from traveling to Cuba.
Yeah, I can't tell if you're optimistic or totally pessimistic, really, about the future of Cuba. Give it to me in one word, optimistic or pessimistic?
I think that there's a big responsibility for those of us outside Cuba to make sure our own countries are keeping with our own laws, which say the US blockade can't be applied to us.
Okay.
There are optimistic angles. They're introducing a lot of solar panel parks, which will provide 60% of their energy needs.
Let me give Jorge some final thoughts quickly. Jorge, go ahead.
Yeah, on the issue of tourism, I just wanted to note that tourism is not from the U.S. is not allowed under the embargo. However, if we remember what happened during the Obama years, in the last 2 years, there was a tremendous increase in the number of travelers, I'll call them, rather than tourists, from the U.S. And that led to the expansion of the tourist sector, to the growth of the private Cuban economy. And then, of course, once those authorizations were lifted by the Trump administration, the economy suffered. So I agree on the one hand that tourism can be a boost to the Cuban economy. On the other hand, I wouldn't place all my faith in allowing U.S. Travelers to Cuba, because as long as the embargo is in place, that won't be allowed.
Okay.
So I agree that it's one of the ways in which the Cuban economy, in fact, it's the mainstay of the Cuban economy in terms of producing foreign currency. But however, it has not recovered from the pandemic and from the previous administration's sanctions on travel to Cuba.
Okay, Jorge, unfortunately, that will have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.